Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. I'm your host, Elif Sarican. Today I'm speaking with Rana Khalaf, who has spent over 15 years studying exactly how local governance emerges, particularly in the context of Syria, survives and gets crushed by the competing pressures of state power, regional intervention, and international either indifference or involvement. So Syria's transition was marketed by many as a new beginning. Instead, what's emerging looks sadly disturbingly like the old pattern, a very centralized authority demanding submission from communities that neither feel represented or protected by it. And in this situation, particularly in this transition, the slight difference also seems to be that it's also backed by an international order that seems to be prizing self-interest and profits over justice. So, Rana, you've described what's happening in Syria as an illiberal peace, stabilisation without transformation. Now, I want to get into the details of that a little bit, because you also were specifically talking about Sweida, where the Druze community are almost entirely based. But can you tell us a bit about what does illiberal peace mean?
So yeah, thank you first of all for having me, Elif. Illiberal peace is the current transition where the world is witnessing from a previous liberal order. Historically, not historically, but at least in the past few decades, we've seen the rise of agreements based on rights, human rights, democratization. We used to go through the UN to solve conflicts. Yes, there was a lot of criticism in peace and conflict studies on the liberal peace, in the sense that it always had produced illiberal results, in the sense that, for instance, Palestinians were allowed to talk about human rights, but not ultimately self-determination. So again, there was a lot of criticism, but still it has been the best system thus far. In terms of advancing rights, yes, there was work on, for instance, children's rights, women's rights, etc. Now, what we have been seeing in the past few years is the complete shift, the complete sidelining of this discourse about democracy. Democracy has been totally dropped from the dictionary of many interveners. For the what is coming is stabilization. We've seen the drop of the language of human rights. At best, we have some language of minority rights. And again, this very framing of minority and majority is very colonial to start with. This is when people were citizens before, but now in the region, we call them minority and majority. And we divide them based on their identity. So again, and then we see regional powers taking over. Regional powers, Gulf states, Israel, you name it. Peace mediation is going increasingly through them, sidelining the UN. Now we see the rise of the Board of Peace, to name it. But the end result, what we see is a different understanding of peace. What we used to understand peace is about justice, transformation, transitional justice, representation, inclusion. But now peace seems to merely mean security. Security for Western states, security for regional states, and stabilization in the very minimalist understanding.
Yeah, and I mean, in all of this, it seems like particularly the even talk of what freedom might mean for a lot of people seem very, very far away. You recently wrote about what you just said, particularly in the context of the Druze community in Sweida. In Sweida, as you said, 98% of the Druze consider the current interim government led by Ahmed al-Shara unrepresentative, undemocratic, and what they call opaque, which I would like to actually, maybe we can explore a bit about what that means in the context of Syria as well. In the northeast, we also saw the interim or transitional authority launch a military offensive against the Kurdish-led SDF in January after months and months of talks. Alawite communities have faced sectarian violence in the coastal regions. And, it seems that it's a pattern. In some cases, the communities or the constituencies being targeted may look slightly different, but generally speaking, it seems to be a pattern of, the kind of how the idea of a state or to govern is being approached. So, when we talk about this illiberal peace, which often is just spoken about as peace, right? Who benefits from this model of so-called peace, and what does it mean for Syria's minoritized communities? And I say minoritized deliberately because, as you said as well, people will talk about citizens and so on before, but we are really seeing this minoritization as well of communities to perhaps also to dismiss some of those demands. But who is benefiting from this?
So to understand who's benefiting, we need to understand what the revolution and the Arab Spring was about initially. We can never know what each person who revolted against the regime wanted. So it might not be very accurate to say that the revolutions were pro-democracy in that sense, but there was an overwhelming number of people who rose to the streets for democratization. But what really, in the academic sense, revolution means a complete rupture of the power relations forming the state. So we see a totally different change of the social, political, and economic system. Now, if we look at Syria and what formed the Syrian state, and if we take a relational approach, look at the power relations. So historically, we see, even before the Assad, different powers capitalize on clientelism, identity politics and sectarianization, patronage, and corporatism. Corporatism is when you use the state as an intermediary to impact society. So instead of it being bottom up, it's top down. The state is relying on intermediaries from society to control it. So what we saw through from the Assad to the Assad the father to Assad the son, Bashar al-Assad, we saw the social contract was somehow built on the basis having some sort of social security, some sort. And with the introduction of neoliberal policy, we saw this ground being shaken. And then we see the uprising, and we see statistical powers. And when you ask me who benefited, it's statistical powers. Who are these? I would call them counter-revolutionary power, any power that has a lot to lose from shaking the status quo in the sense of not people, but in terms of these power relations, the sectarianism, the identity politics, the clientelism, and statistical powers, we look at them at the state, local, and regional and international level. So yes, we do start from very local intermediaries who had a lot to benefit. The Hamshos in Syria, who have a lot to benefit from, that status quo, and they still find their way to come back in different ways. And then the state. So again, we had Bashar al-Assad, and now we have the interim authorities. And as you mentioned, we see similar patterns. We see similar patterns of identity politics, the use and weaponization of identity. And we see populism in that sense being instrumentalized in that sense around identity. And people are, using that identity as narratives of victimhood and as narratives to attack and victimize others. And then as sources of clientelism, etc. So at the state level, it's every single side that has a lot to benefit from these relations. Regional states move to them and move to those economic deals that are happening. And again, at the international level, international states. So it's every statistical power has a lot to benefit from that. Now, who loses is society at large. And what we see is being weaponized against particularly, you called it right, minoritized groups. Sadly, another form of minority now, women are becoming a minority in the sense of being strongly victimized in that sense. And it doesn't just, it also extends to Sunni groups who are not, walking this path of populism. And so again, it's also important to understand, the different structures of power in play.
Yeah, and I mean, you've also written that the international community, let's call it broadly, in this case, basically the dominant Western powers, namely the US, UK, France has been very active in this, but obviously there's some regional powers as well, like Turkey, Qatar, and Israel, and so on. But that they moved to legitimize the interim government very, very quickly, it seems. And also Ahmed al-Shara himself sought that international legitimization over internal legitimization as well, it seems. And that's what a lot of people have argued. And it seems that this was, well, some have suggested that this was prioritizing short-term stabilization over long-term transformation. Some have said that this is exactly, this kind of, let's call it hyper-centralized, illiberal peace, as you would put it, was what the priority was, because there's a broader redesign of the region. There's several arguments, right? And I guess in some ways they can coexist as well. Why, if we look at the kind of, I guess, the argument that talks about kind of like that short-term stabilization over long-term transformation, why does the international order keep backing this model? And if we look at the broader question of was this part of a strategy to try and redesign the Middle East? How do these interact with each other? Why, and therefore, how can that help us make sense about why the international order keeps backing this kind of model?
Well, it seems to be that we're moving more into, scholars started to argue that we're moving to a multipolar order, and then we see Trump dominating the scene again. And now we're again in doubt. Where is this standing at the moment? But the idea is every state seems to be very inward looking, in the sense of looking at its very narrow interests. So Europe is very interested in, return of refugees, prevention of ISIS in the very narrow sense, understanding ISIS as individuals and not just ideas, and radicalization in that sense. So, and this is part of the problem. And it seems to me that there's an amnesia of, we forgot what happened after the world wars and the pain and the suffering, and what actually brought the world together around this, the human rights talk, the liberal peace talk, and largely also because it failed. We don't see that, these countries eventually democratize, or, it's much easier to continue these relations of power than to actually rupture them. It will create a lot of imbalance at the beginning, which I think the world is tired with. We've been for some time hearing the word Syria fatigue, but just before the Sharia took power, many states normalized with the Assad. So again, reach a point where, just give us a stable state we can deal with, and you deal internally, with your people. We will tolerate some violations to a level, and seemingly that threshold keeps increasing.
Yeah, and I mean, you spoke about it was very interesting to hear about the the way you spoke about also women, particularly in Syria, are, kind of becoming or being almost relegated to a status of a minoritized community, or like a similar status in that sense. And, there's been some talk of, kind of like women's involvement or not. But really, the future of women in Syria has been very absent from particularly the international discussion, but also, the internal, it seems as well, particularly of the, you know, of the interim government, but those close to it. The one related element, I suppose, is, the women's protection units, the YPG, have been asked to disarm, and they have declared that disarmament is a red line. Their spokesperson has said that their struggle is not about land, but a wider battle for self-rule, determination, and women's liberation. But we also saw that the January ceasefire agreement between Damascus and the Syrian Democratic Forces doesn't even talk about the YPG. Some argue that their continued existence is a necessary guarantee for women's political participation in a Syria that the new authority has already shown what its vision for women looks like in certain places, like, for example, certain parts of the country where, there's been reports where, makeup has been banned, for example. And also in some places, we've seen the way, like, women's bodies have been treated. You've spoken about the absence of women in all positions of power within the current interim government. Are these related for you? As someone who studied how local governance emerges and gets dismantled, what does it mean, not just for Kurds, but all Syrian women, if the YPG is forced to dissolve, beyond it being a military structure? Do you think that they are related? And if so, what would it mean?
Now, if it's women, volunteering for self-determination, that's also another question. But I have always been more of an observer in that sense, and unsure of women, because it's intersectional. It's not just, especially the role that the YPG, SDF in general has played in their governance. And we don't see that it was very inclusive either, or participatory. And it made me wonder at many points, had they been more inclusive, let's say in Arab majority areas, would we have seen those deflections? Or is it that we're talking about, sure, they instrumentalized the war on terror on ISIS, etc. So that's quite problematic in that sense, in the sense of inclusion. Now, that said, the formation of the SDC in general, and I think it's the only organization or the non-state actor that brought forward a legal framework protecting women in that sense in the political sphere. So that I see as a positive development, and I'm not sure about the military angle with that sense. So yeah, if the YPG is meant to stay, would that protect women in general? I'm not very sure that would be the case. Were they protecting women? Were they protecting a particular group structure, etc.? That is not my research area again, so I wouldn't give any I wouldn't take clear-cut conclusions from that. But in general, we see patriarchy always intersects with authoritarianism, so it's not surprising. They've been building on the continuity of power in terms of, we see increasingly clientelism, we see increasingly identity politics, and of course, patriarchy intersects this. So not very surprised in that sense.
I guess my other question is the looking at the position of women across Syria. That's obviously Kurdish women, Arab women of different religious sects, obviously of no religious sects as well, Druze women, there's so, like, Armenian women, Turkmen women, and so on. What would need to happen for there to be an actual an actual shift in I guess women's inclusion, but perhaps even going beyond that, for there to be a shift? Is it possible with this current interim government, I guess, is the short question.
Now, is it possible depends on the international context as well, and the international deals happening. on the extent to which decentralization is possible and different areas are able to govern their areas. Now, what we see is, from my perspective, yes, we see a clear trend towards authoritarian recycling. You said it, we see a very lack of transparency in terms of justice, the inclusion of civil society and women, etc. However, we cannot deny that at this stage, we are year 2025, March 2025, we're still much better off than during Bashar al-Assad dictatorship era. But also, we need not forget that Hafiz al-Assad took 6 years to grip totally power and suffocate, political life in Syria. Now, will the new interim authority reach that level? Their tactics seem to be a little different in the sense that we will not at this point detain you for saying what you say, but we will unleash an army, an electronic army on you, to destroy your character. We will not say that we killed the Druze in Sweida. It's the tribes. So there's a whole dependence on this plausible deniability, that there was no formal order from the state to actually attack As-Suwayda. It was the tribes who volunteered to do it, and thanking them by the interim president was a mistake. So again, the tools seem to be a little bit different. Now, to what level can we keep on, as a state, use this, plausible deniability in a way, say that the state did not order that, it's beyond the state and we need security sector reform. So that's really questionable there, like in terms of what is happening at the moment. With this in mind, there's a lot more civic space, for, rights are taken, they're not given, women are rising up, civil society is rising up, but I think no one should wait for it just to rain on them. It will not. And we've seen from the HTS and its part of its survival, it's because it did change some rules when it was managing, when it was governing Idlib. So we see that it has this level of pragmatism that, when pushed, it might cede power a little bit, but to what extent, this is questionable. And this is the tension that we will see eventually rising.
I suppose also the question that a lot of people are wondering is, to what extent is particularly the question of women a core or an anchor of the HDS's approach, or is it something that they can be pragmatic around? And I guess this is what also a lot of people are wondering. You've also argued that, and of course it makes a lot of sense that peace is more likely to endure when local communities and diverse cultures and expressions coexist without being forced into one single political identity or political script. You point that, you've also spoken about certain civic alternatives like the National Salvation Initiative in Sweida, but also there are other civil society structures of the Druze community. Can you tell us a bit about some of the forms of civil society that exists in Sweida?
So yeah, what exists in Sweida, I mean, it's important to indicate that Sweida has been outside the government's control since 2023. So it didn't just, move out of the government's control when the new authorities came to power. And there was some form of civil life. And in all across Syria, we saw that whenever the state was limited, we saw the rise of civil society in providing services, humanitarian aid, trying to solve dispute, and Sweida is no exception. This is already happening on the ground. Now, the worry is what also happens usually I've been studying different areas in the northern part of Syria. And what I saw is when those civilian groups rise, the military rises as well. And the military is usually the one supported by regional and international actors and states. And soon the military takes over the civil. So we see that there will be a competition rises between the local councils and the military council when the military council decides that it wants more power, and this power it can generate by controlling the local council, the provision of services to gain legitimacy. And this is my fear in Sweida, because it did happen elsewhere in Syria. However, and this is what's possibly, there are a lot, like the interim governments keep pointing fingers on Al-Hijri, and they have been involved in violations, which is actually true. This hasn't been spoken much of. But what's different in As-Suwayda is that we do have a relatively more mature civil society that's trying to negotiate, between this actor. It's different, when all the community is from one area, it's a different negotiation because there's more to lose, together as a group. So based on that, if supported, these forms of civil society, we can see a much more, we call it peace formation in peace and conflict studies. You actually get to the root causes of the conflict. We see more potential, with being able to manage Sweida, but at the same time, reduce this existential risk from the state, because in Sweida at this point, I have yet to meet a single person from Sweida who feels safe with any side from the interim authority coming into Sweida, even though we see that now the authority has been much more careful with the armed groups it sends. So we haven't seen yet more of the human rights reports about, the violations that happened. I have yet to read about, what happened in the Northeast being as violent as what happened in Sweida. So possibly they learned the lesson of who to send, who not to send, to behave a little bit better. There's a lot of fingers they throw on the problem with security sector reform, that they can't control the army. So we'll see how this is moving forward. But within Sweida itself, what I'm trying to say is that we do have a civil society anchor we could back and support instead of ignoring, and take seriously instead of, dealing through armed groups, being Al-Hijri or the states. We do have alternatives, and we do have alternatives not only in Sweida, everywhere else in Syria.
And I mean, of course, the local governance and a form of decentralization it seems like would be the priority. But are there any particular constitutional demands coming out from Sweida as well in, the attempt to, well, there still doesn't seem to be an actual kind of popular attempt to create a new constitution for Syria, but are there any particular demands in that sense as well?
I think for that we need to ask people in Sweida. But what I see now is extremely limited trust in the state itself. Extremely, we need to rebuild that trust between, the state and Sweida. And you don't just build this trust by words. We need to see action. We need to see that the state is meaningfully, including others in the central government. And then other areas might feel that, yes, we can trust this government in terms of, its intention to share the rule. Now, what I also want to highlight is, if we look at different minoritized groups, be it the Kurds, the Druze, the Alawites, and the Christians, the attitude of the Christians we did this survey, national survey in Syria, and we see the percentage of the acceptance of governance by the central government, by the Christians, not high, but higher than other groups, non-Sunni. And I think the reason is the government does not see a threat by the Christians, because the Christians are dispersed across the country. They are not They cannot govern an area, as in Sweida or as in the coastal region, or as in. So the tension is much less than in other areas. So again, the thrust goes the other way, where the central government wants to impose its rule on all, all the territory across Syria. But the problem, again, is this very limited understanding of the state. Territorially controlling areas is not the same as gaining the trust of population. It's very different. You need to build these relations, and these relations can only be built by actually ceding some power to the local communities, not the elites in these communities, but actually local communities to share that power, and not in the sense of identity politics and clientelism. Meaningful sharing of power, and of course women play a significant part in that.
Particularly the approach of wanting to control all of the physical territory that is current, that has been Syria for about, now, I guess, just over 100 years, over gaining trust and also other forms of influence. Some argue that this is necessary for the international legitimacy, in that the interim government is able to, extend control to all of these areas, and that's related to some of the resources of Syria as well. Can we say that is true? Is this attempt to, or this desire to control the physical territory of Syria, is that because the resources of Syria is more of a priority to the interim government than anything else, or are we missing something here?
So to govern, you need two things. You need resources, not just natural resources, technical resources, human resources, etc., and you need rules. Now, the rules can be regulative in terms of the laws, the violence, the monopoly over violence, etc., and constitutive in terms of meaning creation. That's the education system, the media. So all these are important. But in the very narrow understanding of the state, the Weberian understanding, the monopoly of violence over territory and people. So if the central government is understanding the state in that sense, and many within, the local and international community, that's how they understand the state, not as a relation of power, but as the monopoly of violence and power over population and territory. So in that sense, yes, resources is very important in that sense. But the next question is, will these resources be distributed equally within the state? Or will we see another, recycling of, the capture of the state, and will we see, the benefits of those resources to build a state in that sense and share it equally, or we will see again the exclusion of the periphery, and again towards that support towards the center. So that's very important. That said, in that understanding of sovereignty, yes, we can see, but does Syria actually really control it? The Paris deal earlier, it seems to be that Israel gains the influence over the south and Turkey gains the influence over the north, and this is what actually happened with the quick takeover of the central government of the northeast. So to what extent does actually the Syrian state have sovereignty in terms of, its movement within the country, its policy making within the country? Does it really have this, with this, division of sphere of influence between Israel and Turkey at the moment, or not?
This is quite vehemently denied by the interim government, and particularly by Ahmed al-Shara, that he has made basically any concessions to, particularly has been very vehement about any concessions to Israel, but also that, Turkey as a state has any actual, I guess, like influence in the way that, it has been observed by many. What is actually happening now? Like, as in, because there's been a lot of kind of calls that Turkey will withdraw, for example, from Afrin, which it was occupying since 2018 in the northwest of the country. but we're also seeing the Israeli army kind of like go further into particularly the Golan Heights. What is actually happening, even despite what the interim government is saying, and particularly Ahmed al-Shara?
I think what is actually happening is the silent competition between Turkey and Israel over Syria. And really, boots on the ground isn't necessarily the only way to control a country. Control it economically. You control it by controlling access to water. Turkey, controls one side. Turkey, and in that sense, you cannot envy, the interim. How can it move, with two big states controlling the sources of water to the country, controlling the energy? How do you move around that? How do you actually provide the key services to the citizens and gain legitimacy from that? So again, in a way, the geopolitics does dictate, some negotiation in that sense. So this is the reality as we see it. How this will move forward, I think hard to tell at the moment, but clearly I think we will see much more competition between Israel. Like the next stage after Iran is the competition between Israel and Turkey on Syrian land, be it direct or indirect.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't seem like there is an end in sight in that. As a final question, I want to ask you, there was this quite kind of like complimentary, positive documentary made by the BBC about the only woman that is in the Syrian cabinet currently, about Hind Kabawat. And it was, kind of, it was presented as this like very hopeful and very positive thing, that there was basically one woman minister, and who also happens to be, of basically like social affairs. Can you? I'd like to. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. I mean, I guess it would. Who knows why the BBC did that? I guess that's perhaps a separate thing. But what does it mean that Hind is a minister? And I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
So to study impact is quite hard at this point, but is Hind changing the gender relations within the state? Will she? Is she having any influence over that? Or is she being instrumentalized, as, a female face to legitimize the government? And I can't answer either side. But we need to look at agency. What is Hind really doing? Is she, advancing women's rights in that sense, or is she being only sidelined and used? I mean, the same with other technocrats in the government. And I think one of the times I posed was in Sweida. What did Hind, or the minister of the tech, Abdussalam Haikal, do? Abdussalam Haikal cut the internet on Sweida. So they are technocrats, government staff in that sense. I still wait to see, the agency, what agency is being played. Now, this said, my view of the world is, I mean, I do respect, civil society to do activists from inside the system, from outside it, power over, power within, but I'm unsure whether Hind can do that much change as the only woman. Obviously, she is being fought, even with the limited space she has. She's being fought strongly. But we have yet to see agency. I haven't seen the BBC documentary, but I think for what we need to do is actually really challenge the entire, discontinuity of power relations, the clientelism, the identity politics, and that's when you actually create a real rupture. But do we need people within the system? I think we definitely need that. So what role Hind plays is yet to be seen. And just because we're not seeing we know what role she's playing. It doesn't mean that there's no agency there. We just have yet to see. We cannot conclude either way.
Thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts, Rana. It was really incredible to talk to you, and I'm sure there'll be other times that we talk as well. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Elif. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.